The setting sun poured golden streaks across the polished marble floors of the mansion, but I barely noticed. I stood in the bedroom watching her. Eliza, my wife. She was adjusting the deep blue dress she'd chosen for tonight's gala, turning slightly in the mirror to check the fit. The fabric hugged her figure perfectly, elegant and poised, just like she always seemed in public. But there was something about the way she moved tonight. Something just off. You know how important tonight is, I said, my voice steady but pointed. The merger announcement isn't just another event. It's a chance to show we're strong, unified. That dress. It's a little. I trailed off, searching for the right word, though the message was clear. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she paused, smoothing the fabric as she met my gaze in the mirror. Her eyes sparkled, but not in the way I remembered from years ago. There was an edge there now, sharp and unreadable. It's always about appearances with you, isn't it, James? She said, her tone smooth but icy. Heaven forbid I want to feel beautiful for once. Her words hit harder than I wanted to admit, but I didn't show it. I just adjusted my tie and nodded, like I always did when I didn't feel like arguing. It wasn't just the dress tonight. It was the late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room, the unexplained charges on her credit card, the way her smile, the one that used to light up a room, had become something private, something reserved for someone else. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I need to stop by the office before the gala, I said, keeping my tone casual. She turned slightly, watching me as I grabbed my jacket. I could feel her eyes on me, but I didn't look back. It wasn't a lie, I really was going to the office, but not for work. Earlier that day, I'd received a message from Daniel Carter, my head of security. Protocol 7 was live, and tonight I was going to find out the truth. By the time I pulled out of the driveway, the knot in my stomach had grown tighter. It wasn't just about Eliza. Something larger was at play here. I could feel it. The late nights, the secretive behavior, it wasn't just personal. It felt calculated. The drive to the office was short, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. When I built Harrison Technologies, I told myself it would be more than a business. It would be my legacy. My life's work. Now, for the first time, it felt like everything I'd built was teetering on the edge of collapse. I parked in the underground lot and entered the secure wing of the building. Most people didn't even know this section existed. It was where the real work happened, cybersecurity systems, threat detection protocols, and now surveillance. Daniel was waiting for me in the operations room, surrounded by screens showing live feeds, encrypted files, and data logs. He didn't waste any time. "You're going to want to see this," he said, nodding toward the central monitor. I followed his gaze, my heart thudding harder than I liked to admit. The screen flickered to life, showing the gala venue where Eliza was supposed to be mingling with the board members and investors. But she wasn't just mingling. She was with Victor Stone. Victor, my CO, my supposed best friend. The man I trusted with not just my company, but my family. They were standing too close, her hand lightly brushing his arm as they spoke. He leaned in, saying something that made her laugh. A real, genuine laugh I hadn't heard in months. My jaw tightened as I watched the scene unfold. It wasn't just their body language. It was the way they looked at each other. Comfortable.
Familiar.
Intimate. Daniel's voice cut through my thoughts. "This was taken earlier tonight," he said, pulling up another feed. It showed Eliza and Victor slipping away from the main hall into a private corridor. My stomach dropped. I forced myself to take a deep breath, my mind already spinning. This wasn't just about Eliza's betrayal. Victor was deeply embedded in Harrison Technologies. He had access to confidential data, financial records, everything. If he was undermining me personally, who's to say he wasn't doing the same professionally? I turned to Daniel, my voice colder than I intended. "Expand surveillance on Victor," I said. "Financial records, communications, travel logs. If there's a connection between this and the discrepancies we've been seeing, I want it all." Daniel nodded, already working. I stayed in the room for another moment, watching the screen as Eliza and Victor emerged from the private corridor. their expressions calm and composed. They looked like two people who thought they'd gotten away with something. They hadn't. As I left the operations room and stepped back into the quiet of the building's main corridor, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a betrayal of my marriage. It was an attack on my life's work, my legacy, and I wasn't about to let it stand. For now, I'd stay quiet, gathering every piece of evidence I needed. But when the time came, I wouldn't hold back. Eliza and Victor didn't know it yet, but the game had already changed. It was like watching a building crumble brick by brick. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about Eliza and Victor sneaking around behind my back. It wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was something much bigger, much more calculated. And I wasn't just a husband wronged, I was a target. I stayed late at the office that night, the glow of the surveillance monitors casting sharp shadows in the dim room. Daniel had pulled up everything he could find: emails, transaction logs, surveillance footage. Each new piece of evidence felt like another nail in the coffin of the life I thought I knew. Eliza wasn't just flirting with Victor. She was working with him. Together, they were plotting something far more sinister. Victor wasn't just a friend or my COO. He was a traitor. And he wasn't acting alone. "Ethan Maxwell," Daniel said, his voice low as he turned one of the screens toward me. On it was a series of emails exchanged between Victor and Ethan, a business rival who had been circling Harrison Technologies for years like a shark scenting blood. "It's not just about the merger," Daniel continued. "This is a coordinated effort to weaken the company from the inside. They're trying to steal it out from under you." I leaned forward, my jaw tightening as I scanned the emails. The language was vague, but the intent was clear. Victor had been feeding Ethan confidential information, financial projections, R&D data, even personal details about me. And then there was Eliza. She wasn't just complicit. She was active. Her name appeared in several of the emails, and there were financial transactions linking her to accounts I didn't recognize. Accounts tied directly to Ethan Maxwell's offshore holdings. Couldn't believe it. The woman I had shared my life with, the mother of my children, was part of a plot to destroy everything I had built. But the worst part? That was still to come. "Sir," Daniel said, hesitating for a moment, "there's more." He pulled up another set of files. These weren't about Eliza or Victor. They were about Henry, my brother. I felt the blood drain from my face as I read the documents. Henry had been running fake research projects under the company's R&D division, siphoning millions of dollars into his own accounts. It was a shell game carefully constructed to avoid detection, but now the pattern was clear. "How long?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. "At least 2 years," Daniel replied. "Maybe longer." I clenched my fists, the betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. Henry and I had grown up together, shared everything. I had given him a position in the company out of trust, out of loyalty, and he had used it to stab me in the back. It wasn't just the money. It was the principle, the legacy. Harrison Technologies wasn't just a company. It was the culmination of years of sacrifice and vision. And now it felt like everyone I trusted had a hand in tearing it apart. But it didn't stop there. Daniel pulled up a video clip next, and my heart sank as I recognized the faces on the screen. It was Eliza and Rachel, my daughter. Rachel was sitting on the edge of her bed, her expression conflicted, while Eliza spoke to her in hushed tones. "You know your father means well, but he's always putting work first," Eliza said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Sometimes I wonder if he even sees how hard this is on you and Oliver." Rachel nodded, her brow furrowed. Eliza continued, planting seeds of doubt with every word. "It's not your fault, sweetheart. He's always been so focused on the company. Sometimes I think he forgets what really matters." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. It wasn't enough for Eliza to betray me professionally. She was trying to turn my own children against me. I turned away from the screen, staring at the wall as the weight of it all pressed down on me. My marriage, my family, my company, everything I had worked so hard to build, was under attack from every angle. But I couldn't let it show. "Daniel," I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. We need to act. Quietly. I want every piece of this puzzle laid out in front of me. No loose ends. He nodded, already typing away at his console. I left the office just before dawn, the city still cloaked in darkness. As I drove home, I couldn't stop replaying the events of the night in my mind. Eliza, Victor, Ethan, Henry. They had all betrayed me in their own ways, each one playing a role in this twisted game. But they had made one critical mistake. They underestimated me. When I pulled into the driveway, the mansion loomed in the pre-dawn light, its grandeur feeling hollow now. I stepped inside, my mind already working through the next steps. I couldn't confront them yet. Not without more evidence, not without a plan. Eliza was still asleep when I entered the bedroom. She looked peaceful, serene, like the betrayal wasn't weighing on her at all. I stood there for a moment, staring down at her, the anger simmering just below the surface. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about exposing them. It was about taking back control. About reminding them and myself that I wasn't someone to be underestimated. By the time I left the room, I had made my decision. This wasn't going to be a fight. It was going to be a reckoning. The gala was in full swing by the time I arrived back at the office. I watched it unfold through a live feed on one of the monitors in the secure room, my jaw tightening as Eliza laughed and mingled with guests, a glass of champagne in hand. Beside her, Victor played his part perfectly, shaking hands, making toasts, and pretending as though he hadn't just betrayed me in the most personal and professional way imaginable. But they didn't know what was coming. In the corner of the room, Daniel was already at work, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he executed the first phase of Protocol Zero. It was something I'd designed years ago, a contingency plan in case Harrison Technologies ever faced a catastrophic internal threat. At the time, I'd thought it was more of a precaution than a necessity. Now it was my lifeline. Phase 1 is complete, Daniel said, not looking up from his screen. Good, I replied, my voice cold and steady. Lock down everything. Financial accounts, intellectual property, and any active projects. I want every possible asset under our control before they even realize what's happening. Daniel nodded, and I turned back to the monitors, watching as Eliza and Victor reveled in their perceived victory. I could almost hear their conversation. Smug remarks about the merger, backhanded comments about how I'd never see it coming. But they were wrong. By the time the gala ended, Harrison Technologies would be untouchable. The first move was financial. Every account tied to the company was encrypted, and millions of dollars were diverted into secure trusts that only I could access. It wasn't about hiding money. It was about ensuring that no one, not Victor, not Eliza, not even Ethan Maxwell, could touch the lifeblood of my empire. Next came the legal measures. I had my team dismantle every shell company they'd used to siphon funds and manipulate stock prices. Each one was dissolved with surgical precision, leaving no trace of their schemes. I even had Daniel's team plant evidence tying Victor and Ethan to several offshore accounts. By the time the authorities reviewed the data, the two of them would be facing more than just my wrath. They'd be dealing with federal investigators. Sir, we've identified another account linked to Eliza, Daniel said, pulling up a screen. I stepped closer, my eyes narrowing as I scanned the details. It wasn't just about the money anymore. Eliza had been funneling funds into an account set up in Rachel's name, likely to use it as leverage later. My stomach churned at the thought of her using our children as pawns in her scheme. Redirect it, I said sharply. Transfer the funds into the trust one set up for Rachel and Oliver. Make sure she can't touch a cent of it. Daniel hesitated for a moment before nodding. Understood. As the night went on, the pieces began to fall into place. I could feel the tension in the room, the quiet intensity of a plan coming together. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming control. By midnight, I was ready for the final phase. I had already sent encrypted messages to the board, outlining the evidence I'd gathered against Victor and the others. When they woke up tomorrow, there would be no question about who was loyal to the company and who wasn't. But before the hammer fell, there was one last thing I needed to do. I watched Eliza through the surveillance feed as she stood on the balcony of the gala venue, her champagne glass catching the light of the city skyline. She looked radiant, confident, like someone who thought she'd won. But I knew better. I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice dripping with the false sweetness she always used when she wanted something. "James? Are you at the gala? I didn't see you." "No," I said evenly. "I'm taking care of things at the office." There was a pause. I could hear the faint sound of her heels clicking as she walked away from the crowd, likely trying to find a quiet spot. "You've been so busy lately," she said, her tone softening. "I was hoping we could talk tonight, maybe reconnect." I almost laughed. The audacity of her words was staggering, but I kept my composure. "We'll talk soon," I said, the double meaning not lost on me. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." Before she could respond, I ended the call. Back in the operations room, Daniel turned to me with a grim expression. "The final measures are in place. Are you ready to execute?" I nodded, my gaze steady. "Do it." With a single keystroke, Daniel activated the protocol. As the clock struck midnight, the trap was sprung. Eliza, Victor, and Ethan had no idea what had just hit them. The funds they'd siphoned were gone. The accounts they'd created were locked, and the data they thought was secure had been exposed. Back at the gala, I could see the panic beginning to set in. Victor's phone buzzed repeatedly as messages and notifications poured in. I watched as he stepped away from the crowd, his expression growing darker with each passing second. Eliza, too, seemed unsettled. She glanced around, her smile faltering as she realized something was wrong. By the time they figured out the extent of the damage, it would be too late. As I sat in the quiet of the operations room, watching the chaos unfold, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. This wasn't just about justice, it was about reclaiming what was mine. Eliza, Victor, Ethan, they thought they could outsmart me. They thought they could take what I had built and leave me with nothing. But they forgot one crucial detail. I don't lose. The morning after the gala, a calm settled over me. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from relief. There was still too much at stake for that. But it was the steady resolve of a man who knew his enemies were finally falling. I sipped my coffee in the quiet of my study, watching the sun climb over the horizon. The first emails started rolling in shortly after 7 a.m. The board members were the first to respond, shocked, confused, and scrambling to understand how Victor Stone, the COO of Harrison Technologies, had been caught funneling sensitive company information to our biggest competitor, Ethan Maxwell. By 8 a.m., Victor's phone must have been buzzing nonstop. I imagined him waking up in his penthouse, still basking in the glow of last night's celebration, only to find his world crumbling around him. "Sir," Daniel said, stepping into the room with his tablet in hand. "The SEC is investigating Victor as we speak. They've already frozen his accounts, and the offshore links we provided should lead them straight to Maxwell." "Good," I said, setting my coffee down. "Make sure the board gets a detailed report of everything Victor's done. I want them to see the full scope of his betrayal." Daniel nodded and hesitated for a moment before adding, "There's more. Maxwell's team is in damage control mode, but their internal communications are in disarray. It's only a matter of time before they start turning on each other." A flicker of satisfaction crossed my face. They had underestimated me, thinking I wouldn't see through their plan until it was too late. Now, they were the ones scrambling, their alliances fracturing under the weight of their own greed. Victor wasn't the only one who faced the consequences that morning. By mid-morning, federal agents raided Henry Caldwell's offices. My brother, my own flesh and blood, had been running fake R&D projects for years, siphoning millions from Harrison Technologies under the guise of legitimate development. When I first discovered his betrayal, it had felt like a knife to the gut. Now, watching the footage of agents hauling boxes of documents and servers out of his building, I felt nothing. Henry had a chance to come clean. I'd confronted him weeks ago when I first suspected something was wrong, giving him an out, a chance to explain himself. Instead, he doubled down, feeding me lies while lining his pockets with money meant for the future of the company. "Henry signed a confession," Daniel said later that afternoon, his tone devoid of sympathy. "The authorities have everything they need to shut him down completely." I nodded, staring at the grainy footage on my laptop as Henry was escorted out of his office. He looked pale, his normally confident stride replaced with something timid, almost broken. He'd called me earlier that day, his voice shaking as he begged for leniency. "James, I was desperate," he had said. "You have to understand, I never meant for it to go this far." I didn't respond. I just let the silence stretch, forcing him to sit in the consequences of his actions. When he finally hung up, it was with a quiet, defeated sigh. Sandy Blake was next. She had always been an opportunist, someone who thrived on taking what didn't belong to her. For years, she had been secretly running a competing business based on technology stolen from Harrison Technologies. She must have thought she was untouchable, her backdoor channels and hidden connections keeping her safe. But no one stays untouchable forever. By noon, lawsuits were piling up against her. Intellectual property theft, trade secret violations, fraud. One by one, her investors pulled out, distancing themselves from the growing legal storm. Her company's stock plummeted, and by the end of the day, her entire operation was shuttered. Sandy called me once, years ago, trying to bait me into a partnership. I remembered her tone. Smooth, calculated, and just a little too confident. That same arrogance had been her downfall. And then there was Eliza. The emails I'd sent her the night before were short, direct, and devastating. Copies of financial transactions, encrypted communications, and even footage from the gala were all laid out with meticulous precision. She couldn't deny what she'd done. There was no room for excuses. I didn't hear from her immediately, and that silence spoke volumes. She must have known she was cornered. The accounts she'd set up with Victor were frozen, her leverage over the children dismantled by the trust I'd created, and her co-conspirators falling one by one. By late afternoon, she called me. "James," she began, her voice shaky but still laced with the charm she'd always relied on. "Can we talk? Please, I just need to explain." "There's nothing to explain," I interrupted, my tone colder than I expected. "You made your choices, Eliza. Now you can live with the consequences." There was a pause, and I could hear her breathing, rapid and uneven. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I thought." She trailed off, the words escaping her. I ended the call before she could say more. By evening, the conspirators were in freefall. Victor was under investigation. Henry's empire had collapsed. Sandy's company was in ruins, and Eliza's carefully constructed web of deceit had unraveled completely. I stood on the balcony of my mansion, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. It wasn't victory I felt, at least not entirely. It was something colder, quieter. Justice. My enemies had fallen, one by one, not because of revenge, but because they thought I was blind. They thought I'd let sentiment and trust cloud my judgment. They were wrong. And as the night deepened, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just the end of their schemes. It was the beginning of something far greater. Revenge wasn't meant to be impulsive. It wasn't something you rushed in a fit of rage. No, real justice required patience, precision, and a willingness to watch your enemies unravel, piece by piece, until they were left standing amidst the ruins of their own choices. For Henry, the process began the moment the federal agents raided his office. That was only the start. I knew my brother better than anyone, knew how deeply he relied on his investments to sustain the image of success he'd crafted for himself. The lavish homes, the luxury cars, the jet-setting lifestyle, it all hinged on those investments. So I decided to take them away. Daniel's team went to work, analyzing Henry's portfolio and identifying key vulnerabilities. It didn't take long. With subtle moves in the market, carefully timed leaks, and quiet whispers to the right people, Henry's assets began to crumble. Stocks he'd relied on suddenly plummeted, investments turned sour, and the businesses he supported found themselves inexplicably struggling. By the end of the week, Henry's phone must have been ringing off the hook. Bankers, advisors, and lawyers all scrambling to make sense of what was happening. But I knew the truth. This wasn't a coincidence. It was deliberate. "Sir," Daniel said one morning, walking into my study with his ever-present tablet in hand, Henry just sold his penthouse. Looks like he's consolidating what's left. I nodded, sipping my coffee as I gazed out at the city skyline. Keep monitoring him, I said. If he tries to rebuild, I want to know about it. Sandy Blake's downfall was less personal, but no less satisfying. Her company, once a thorn in Harrison Technologies' side, was little more than a house of cards built on stolen technology. And when the foundation of that house was exposed, it didn't take much to bring it crashing down. My team began by exploiting the vulnerabilities in her infrastructure. It wasn't difficult. Her reliance on stolen tech meant her systems were poorly integrated, riddled with weak spots. With each calculated move, we exposed those weaknesses, hacking into her networks and leaking critical information to her clients. The fallout was immediate. I just received word, Daniel said one afternoon, his tone carrying a hint of satisfaction. Sandy lost her biggest client this morning. That's the third one this week. Good, I replied, scrolling through a report on my laptop. Keep the pressure on. I want her to understand exactly what happens when you steal from me. By the end of the month, Sandy's company was in shambles. Lawsuits mounted, investors pulled out, and her remaining clients jumped ship. Her reputation, once a point of pride, was now a liability. And then there was Victor. Victor's downfall wasn't just about exposing him to the board, it was about ensuring he could never recover. The media was ruthless. Once the evidence of his betrayal went public, every news outlet in the industry picked up the story. Articles detailing his fraudulent schemes, his collusion with Ethan Maxwell, and his attempt to undermine Harrison Technologies dominated the headlines. I watched it all unfold from the comfort of my office, the cold satisfaction of justice settling in my chest. Victor's name, once synonymous with ambition and success, was now a cautionary tale. You've officially cut him off, Daniel said, showing me a report on Victor's accounts. He's out of options. No funds, no allies, and no future in the industry. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a quiet sigh. Good. Let him feel the weight of it. Eliza, meanwhile, was fighting a losing battle. Her schemes, once so carefully constructed, were unraveling faster than she could manage. The financial accounts she'd set up with Victor were frozen. The trust I'd built for Rachel and Oliver ensured she had no leverage, and the social circles she relied on for influence were turning cold. But it wasn't just her public life that was crumbling. It was the private one, too. Rachel and Oliver had thrived under my guidance. Away from Eliza's manipulations, they were beginning to see the truth for themselves. Rachel, who had once seemed so distant, was now confiding in me about her future. Oliver, ever curious and bright, had started shadowing me at work, asking questions about the business and showing a budding interest in what I'd built. One evening, as we sat in the living room, Rachel turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," she said, her voice hesitant, Do you think Mom will ever get better? Stop. All of this." Her question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. "I don't know, Rachel," I said, meeting her gaze. "But what I do know is that you and Oliver will always have what you need, no matter what happens." She nodded, seeming to find comfort in my words. By the end of the month, the dismantling was complete. Henry was financially ruined. Sandy's company was no more. Victor's career was over, and Eliza was left with nothing but the weight of her own choices. And yet, as I stood in my office one evening, staring out at the city lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. For all my careful planning, there was still something unresolved, something lurking in the shadows. "Sir," Daniel said, interrupting my thoughts. I turned to see him holding a file, his expression unusually tense. "You're going to want to see this," he said, placing it on my desk. I opened the file, my eyes scanning the pages. As I read, my heart sank. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The corporate headquarters of Harrison Technologies had come a long way in 6 years. The gleaming skyscraper was a testament to resilience, standing tall as the pinnacle of everything I had rebuilt. From the outside, it was a fortress of glass and steel, an emblem of progress. But inside, within the walls of my office, the ghosts of the past had decided to pay a visit. I hadn't seen Eliza in years. Not since the lawsuits, the investigations, and the quiet unraveling of her carefully constructed schemes. But there she was, standing in the lobby of my building, holding the hand of a young boy who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. The sight of her was jarring. She was a shadow of the woman I once knew. The polished elegance and sharp confidence had been replaced by something brittle. Her once perfect posture sagged, and her eyes, though still striking, carried the weight of desperation. I received word of her arrival from the security desk. My first instinct was to turn her away, to let her see that the world she once tried to control no longer had a place for her. But then my gaze drifted to the boy. Lucas. Send her up, I said, leaning back in my chair. When Eliza entered my office, she hesitated for a moment, as if trying to summon the confidence that had once been her armor. Lucas clung to her side, his wide eyes scanning the room. James, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't know where else to go. I studied her for a long moment before responding. And why would you think here was an option? She flinched but pressed on. I came for Lucas, she said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. He's your son, James. He deserves. I held up a hand, cutting her off. Don't, I said firmly, my voice carrying the weight of years of betrayal and anger. You don't get to walk in here after everything and try to rewrite the past. Her face tightened, and for a moment, the old Eliza resurfaced. The one who could spin lies into gold. He's your child, she insisted, her voice rising. You have a responsibility to him. Doi? I asked, standing and walking around my desk. I moved closer, meeting her gaze directly. Because if that were true, why do I already know he's not mine? Her breath caught, and she took an involuntary step back. I reached for a folder sitting on my desk and opened it, pulling out the DNA test results. You see, Eliza, I continued, my tone steady and cold. I've been watching you. I've been watching Lucas. And I've been ensuring that he's cared for, regardless of who his biological parents are. But you... I let the words hang in the air for a moment before placing the papers in front of her. You've been lying. Lucas isn't my son. He's Victor's. The color drained from her face, and for a moment, she seemed on the verge of collapsing. That's not true, she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. It's all right here, I said, pointing to the document. You can't fake this, Eliza. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how much you try to bury it. She sank into the chair across from my desk, her hands trembling as she clutched the armrests. I didn't know what else to do, she whispered, her voice cracking. I've lost everything, James. Everything. I crossed my arms, my gaze unwavering. And whose fault is that? Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt no sympathy. This wasn't about her anymore. I turned my attention to Lucas, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange. He looked up at me with a mixture of curiosity and fear, his small hands clutching the hem of his mother's coat. Lucas, I said softly, crouching to his level. Do you know why your mom brought you here? He shook his head, his brown eyes wide. I offered him a small smile, one that I hoped would ease his nerves. You don't have to worry about anything, okay? I've made sure that you'll always have what you need. His brow furrowed in confusion, but he nodded. I stood, looking back at Eliza. You've used him, I said, my voice hardening. You've used your own child as a pawn in your games. But Lucas isn't responsible for your mistakes, and I won't let him suffer for them. Her tears spilled over, and for a moment, she seemed genuinely remorseful. I didn't know what else to do, she said again, her voice breaking. I shook my head. You had choices, Eliza. You always had choices. But every time you chose yourself. Now you have to live with that. By the time she left my office, escorted by security, she was a shell of the woman she once was. Lucas, on the other hand, stayed behind. I had arranged for a caretaker to take him to a safe, comfortable place where he could thrive. He didn't deserve to be dragged through the chaos of his parents' lives. As the door closed behind them, I sat back in my chair, staring out at the city below. The confrontation hadn't brought me any satisfaction, but it had brought closure. Eliza was no longer a threat. Victor was long gone. The conspirators who had tried to tear me down were nothing more than distant memories. And Lucas? He would grow up in a world where he didn't have to carry the burden of his parents' sins. As I leaned back, a quiet sense of peace washed over me. The battle was over, and for the first time in years, the future felt like it was truly mine again. As I stood in the atrium of Harrison Technologies headquarters, sunlight streaming through the glass dome above, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. It wasn't just about rebuilding, it was about ensuring that what I'd built could never be shaken again. The company was thriving in ways I hadn't imagined possible 6 years ago. The very assets my enemies tried to use against me had become the building blocks of something greater. Victor's failed schemes, Henry's stolen resources, and Sandy's collapsed business ventures had all been absorbed into Harrison Technologies, turned into something more enduring, more powerful. But this wasn't just about the company. It was about the people who stood with me through it all. Rachel and Oliver were no longer the uncertain children caught in the crossfire of their mother's manipulations. Rachel, now in her early 20s, was studying business and showing an aptitude for leadership that reminded me of myself. Oliver, ever curious, had delved into engineering, his mind filled with ideas about innovation and progress. "Dad," Rachel said one afternoon as we sat in my office, "do you ever regret it? Everything that happened?" I looked at her, surprised by the question. "Regret it?" I repeated, considering my words carefully. "I regret trusting the wrong people. I regret the pain it caused you and Oliver. But regret is a luxury I don't have. I had to learn from it, and because of that, we're stronger now." She nodded thoughtfully, her expression resolute. "I think I understand that now." I smiled, pride swelling in my chest. She wasn't just listening. She was learning. My team, too, had grown into something more than just colleagues. Daniel, ever loyal, remained by my side, his sharp mind a crucial asset in navigating the challenges we faced. Sophia, my CFO, had proven her mettle during the storm of lawsuits and financial chaos, guiding us with unwavering precision. And Natalie, who'd started as a junior analyst, had risen through the ranks to become one of my most trusted advisors. Together, they weren't just helping me rebuild, they were helping me secure the future. As for my enemies, their stories were all but closed. Victor, once the golden boy of the corporate world, was now a cautionary tale. His reputation had been destroyed beyond repair, and every attempt he made to claw his way back was met with failure. The world had no room for a man who betrayed those closest to him. Henry had retreated into obscurity, his finances in ruins. The brother who once stood beside me was now just a memory, a painful reminder of how easily trust could be broken. Sandy had vanished from the public eye entirely, her company and credibility gone. She had tried to play a game she didn't understand, and the consequences had swallowed her whole. And then there was Eliza. She had tried to make a life for herself, though I knew it was a hollow one. Her attempts to reclaim the power and influence she once wielded had failed spectacularly. Lucas, her son with Victor, was thriving, but not because of her. I had ensured he was cared for, his future secure, even as Eliza's life fell apart. The last time I saw her was a year ago, at a charity gala she had no business attending. She avoided me the entire evening, her once commanding presence reduced to fleeting glances and half-hearted smiles. The woman who once tried to tear me down now lived in the shadow of her own betrayal. In my office, a single piece of framed art stood out among the sleek, minimalist decor. Eliza's red dress. The same dress she had worn the night of the gala, the night she thought she'd won. I had it framed not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what betrayal looked like, of how easily trust could be shattered, and of how patience and strategy could turn even the most dire situation into an opportunity. Every time I looked at that dress, I felt a sense of resolve. The legacy I'd built wasn't just about wealth or power. It was about integrity, about the people who had stood by me and the family I was determined to protect. One evening, as the sun set over the city, I stood on the balcony of my home, watching the lights flicker to life below. Rachel joined me, leaning on the railing as she gazed out at the view. "You've built something incredible, Dad," she said softly. "Not just the company. All of it." I placed a hand on her shoulder, pride filling my chest. "It wasn't just me," I said. "It was everyone who believed in the right thing. That's what makes it strong." The battles were over, the enemies defeated, and the wounds healed. What remained was a legacy, not of vengeance, but of justice. And as I stood there, watching the future unfold before me, I knew one thing for certain. No one would ever take it away from us again.